Hey everybody, welcome to video 6, the second video in our integumentary system unit. Today we're going to be taking a look at the layers of skin. So to get started looking at the structure of skin, you'll recall that your skin is made of epithelial tissue and specifically stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue covers and lines the body, so obviously the skin is a very good example of epithelial tissue. You have two layers of tissue that make up your skin. You have the epidermis, epi meaning topmost or outermost, and then you have the dermis, which doesn't have a prefix, so it's kind of like your middle layer. You do have what's called the hypodermis, hypo meaning below, but it is technically not a part of the skin. Some older textbooks, some older ways of thinking might tell you that there are 3 layers of skin. There's actually 2, just the epidermis and dermis. We no longer consider the hypodermis a part of the skin. The hypodermis's job is to attach the dermis to the rest of your body. It is primarily made of adipose tissue, which is fat, another type of connective tissue. Role of the hypodermis, it is a shock absorber, it's an insulator. Think how much impact your skin goes through on a daily basis, especially walking, doing things with your hands. So the hypodermis's job is to absorb a lot of that shock, as well as fat, just makes a very good insulator. So looking at the epidermis, it is your outermost layer, so you can see everybody's epidermis when you take a look at them. As I mentioned, the epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelium, and it's kind of hard to differentiate where the epidermis and dermis might be when you're looking at stratified squamous epithelium. Within the epidermis, you have what are called keratinocytes. Their job is to produce keratin. You might see if I can pull out my laser pointer here. Keratin being the root in keratinocyte. Cyte just meaning cell, so it's a cell that produces keratin. Keratin itself is a very, very strong and fibrous protein, meaning when you look at it, it looks like there's a whole bunch of strands within it. Its job is not only to help toughen up your skin, but it is also waterproof, to help waterproof your skin. So what you can do, you can pause this video, you can think about, try to come up with why the keratin is waterproof. So the benefit of having waterproof skin is when you're getting rained on, you aren't taking in a whole bunch of water. Or think when you're swimming, you don't have gallons of water rushing in. But at the same time, and maybe more importantly, when you are out in the sun, especially out in the heat, so that you don't dry out. So that keratin not only makes your skin very good at keeping water from getting in, but it also is really good at keeping water from getting out, which might be even more important. The epidermis is also avascular. We haven't seen this word before. We'll see it a lot during our cardiopulmonary unit. Vascular just means blood vessels or vessels, and A meaning without. So the epidermis is without blood vessels. It does not have any blood vessels running through it. So when you cut yourself and you end up bleeding from a cut, that means you have gotten deeper than the epidermis. Epidermis itself is composed of 5 layers. We'll spend most of this lecture looking at those 5 layers. So from deepest to most superficial, so this is going from as the deepest layer that you can in your skin all the way to the very, very top, you have the stratum basale. The stratum basale is also known as the stratum germinativum. We'll take a look at what that is here in a second. The stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum. On the palms of your hands and on the soles of your feet, you have the stratum lucidum. And then finally, you have the stratum corneum. So 5 layers on the palms of your hands and on the soles of your feet. Everywhere else has 4 layers of the epidermis. There's various ways that you can remember these. We'll probably talk about in class a good way to remember them. But anything that can help you remember BSGLC, or you can go the other way, CLGSB, is one way that you can do it. I remember I had a student a couple of years ago had something like bad seagulls get something chips or another. You just fill it in with any sort of sentence you can think of to be able to help you remember those 5 layers. So the stratum basal or the stratum germinativum, we call it the stratum basal because it is the base. It is the bottom layer of the epidermis. Its job is to be anchored to the dermis so that you don't get it unattached there. And actually what happens if the stratum basal gets pulled away from the dermis, you get a blister. In the stratum basal, you have cells undergoing mitosis. So you might remember that from biology, one cell dividing into 2 cells. That's where we get the stratum germinativum name as well, as cells are germinating. They're forming and starting at that stratum basal. And so what happens when mitosis occurs, the older cell gets pushed superficial. I know it says daughter cells here. Basically, it becomes 2 cells and one of them ends up moving superficially or towards the top of your skin. And then that'll become important later when we're looking at each of these layers all together. Also within the stratum basal, you'll find a lot of melanocytes. Remember, just like keratinocytes, cyte meaning cell, melano means they're producing melanin. And melanin is what gives you your skin color. More melanin means you are a darker skin color. Less melanin means you are a lighter skin color. What happens is pretty much all humans have relatively the same amount of melanocytes in their skin. So it doesn't matter what skin color you are, you have the same number of melanocytes. The only difference comes down to people that have darker skin tones just have more active melanocytes that are producing more melanin. Your stratum spinosum here, your cells that are getting pushed superficially from mitosis, what happens is they start to get a little flatter. Remember, epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium. So they start to get a little more squashed and they start to lose some of the water and other things that are in that cell to where they have a higher percentage of keratin within them. And so with that higher percentage of keratin, they end up being a little bit tougher. The stratum granulosum. The stratum granulosum is named because when you're looking at this, the special dye that you use to look at these cells make them look very, very grainy. So that's why we call them the stratum granulosum. And then you have the stratum lucidum. Again, this is only found on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Reason being, you use those a lot. Those palms and soles are in contact with a lot of surfaces. So that's an extra layer of cells in order to toughen up those parts of your body. And then finally, you have the stratum corneum. At this point, the cells are almost completely full of keratin and not a whole lot else. And so they're basically working like shingles. So as you move from stratum basal to stratum corneum, the cells get progressively more dead, they get progressively flatter, and they end up increasing in their percentage of keratin. Here we can see all of those layers, the stratum basal down here. You have the stratum spinosum making up a large part of this, stratum granulosum, and then stratum corneum. Notice here there is no stratum lucidum, meaning we're not looking at the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot. And you can see down here at the stratum basal, those cells are undergoing mitosis. As you move up, those cells get flatter, they get more dead, and they become more full of keratin. And one thing to mention, the reason these cells are getting more and more dead is because, remember, the epidermis is avascular. There's no blood, which means there's no oxygen, no glucose or anything for these cells. The stratum basal cells survive because the dermis has blood vessels. And so what happens is nutrients will leak out of the dermis into the stratum basal and not a whole lot further. So you end up getting further and further away from your source of nutrients as you move towards the superficial part of the skin. Then lastly, the dermis. We'll take a look at the structures you can find in the dermis in the next lecture. But the dermis lies deep to the epidermis. Remember, deep meaning closer to the innermost part of you and is composed of two layers. You have the papillary layer and then the reticular layer. So the papillary layer is going to be in this section right here, this pink right here. You can see, you can tell the papillary layer because of all these curves that you have here. Those are going to be part of an important structure that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then the reticular layer is deep to that. So it's everything underneath all of those little ridges and curves that you see. So that is the epidermis, as well as a brief talk about the dermis. As always, if you have any questions, make sure you're posting on the updates board.